Some nights, when sleep won't come, I drive until the road forgets where it's going. That's how I found Crescent Bay, a place that didn't seem to want visitors, tucked behind miles of fog and pine. The air smelled of rust and rain, and every house looked like it was holding its breath. And then there was the lighthouse, leaning slightly, like it had been waiting for someone to notice. The sign at its base read, "Built 1874, Keeper Elias M. Rowan." It was the same first name as mine. The sound of the engine faded against the low drone of the ocean. I sat for a while, hands still on the steering wheel, watching the white flash from the lighthouse sweep across the dark. It wasn't supposed to be working. Every map I'd checked said the light was long dead. But there it was, pulsing every 20 seconds like a heartbeat that refused to stop. I'd come here on an impulse, a half-planned project to restore a forgotten landmark. It had been 2 years since I'd picked up a drafting pencil or opened a blueprint. After my wife passed, the work had gone quiet. I had gone quiet. But when I saw a local notice about a grant for historical restoration on the coast of Maine, something inside me stirred. A faint idea that maybe I could build something that lasted longer than grief. The road ended at the edge of the cliffs, where the land dropped straight into the sea. The smell of salt was everywhere, in my clothes, in my lungs, in the wet air that clung to everything. I got out of the car and stood there, watching the waves hit the rocks below, slow and rhythmic, as if the ocean was breathing with me. Behind me, the keeper's cottage sagged under years of neglect. Its shutters hung crooked, its chimney broken in half. Yet something about it was beautiful. The way the porch lamp still swayed gently in the wind, or the tiny weather vane that turned with a creak. As if still performing its duty, I stepped closer, brushing my fingers along the faded doorframe. A small plaque was nailed beside it, barely legible under salt corrosion. For Mara, the light that never went out. I stood there longer than I should have. The sea murmured below, steady as breath, and the words echoed in my head. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and dust. The furniture was sparse, a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a cracked photograph on the mantel. In it, a man and woman stood side by side, their faces blurred by time, the lighthouse a bright blur behind them. As I set down my bag, the wind rattled the shutters. The light outside swept across the room again, soft but insistent, catching the edge of the photograph before vanishing. I whispered to the empty room, "Half to the sea, half to myself. Guess it's just us." Then, the floorboard sighed in reply, or maybe it was just the house settling. Remembering, the first night, I didn't mean to stay. I told myself I'd just take a few measurements, maybe sketch the structure before heading to town. But dusk came faster than I expected, folding the sea into silver, and the road disappeared under fog. The lighthouse kept turning its slow, patient beam, though I couldn't find any power line feeding it. It felt alive, like something breathing beneath the floorboards. And I didn't want to leave. I found a rusted key hanging on a nail by the cottage door. It fit the lighthouse's lock perfectly, as if it had been waiting for a familiar hand. When the heavy door creaked open, a scent of salt and oil drifted out. Not unpleasant, just old. The spiral staircase wound upward, iron steps slick with dew. I traced my fingers along the cold railing, feeling the faint vibration of machinery that shouldn't have been working. Every step echoed in slow rhythm, and above me, the revolving lens sent thin ribbons of light sweeping through the mist. At the top, the lantern room opened like the inside of a watch. The glass panes were cracked in places, the brass fittings tarnished to green. Yet, at its center, stood the great Fresnel lens, perfect and unbroken, rotating with unhurried grace. It should have been impossible. The generator cables were cut clean through. The oil drum was bone dry. And yet the light moved, steady and strong, cutting across the sea like a slow exhale. I found an old logbook resting on the shelf beside the mechanism, its leather cover brittle, edges curled. On the first page, written in looping careful script, April the 12th, 1901, "The sea is calm tonight," Mara sang while trimming the wick. I told her the light turns more smoothly when she sings. She laughed and said, "Then I'll keep it shining forever." Elias Rowan. I stood there, reading the words again and again. Elias Rowan, keeper, and his wife, Mara. Their handwriting was elegant, patient, the kind you rarely see anymore. I flipped through more pages. The entries were small moments, weather, sea conditions, song lyrics, small jokes. But one entry near the end caught me. December 3rd, 1903. The light faltered at midnight. Mara said she heard footsteps on the stairs when I was outside checking the gear. She swore she saw me standing in the doorway. I told her I hadn't come in. She laughed it off. But the sea has been too quiet lately. The handwriting grew shakier in later pages, then stopped abruptly after January 8th, 1904. No final entry. No explanation. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass, erasing the horizon. I sat on the floor beside the lens, the logbook open in my lap. The faint hum beneath the tower deepened, not mechanical, but almost human, like a low humming tone you feel more than hear. When I closed my eyes, I thought I could make out a woman's voice, soft and distant, singing a melody I didn't know but somehow recognized, a simple tune, wordless, old as the tide. I didn't move for a long time. The beam turned slowly around me, brushing my face every few seconds like a pulse, a reminder that the light, and whatever it remembered, was still awake. By morning, the fog hadn't lifted. It hung low and heavy, as if the sky itself had come down to rest on the sea. Somewhere beyond the grey, I heard gulls crying, but their calls sounded distorted, stretched thin, and under it all, faint as breath, there was that same tune again, the one from the night before, a woman's voice humming. I woke on the floor of the lantern room, the logbook still open beside me. My jacket was draped over me, though I couldn't remember doing that. The air smelled faintly of lavender, sweet, old-fashioned, nothing like the mildew that filled the cottage. I leaned against the cold metal wall, listening. The sound came and went, woven between the hiss of waves against the rocks. It was fragile but steady, a lullaby carried by the fog itself. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the confined space. The sound died instantly, swallowed whole. When I climbed down to the keeper's cottage, the air grew warmer. I opened a window, letting in the faint light of a sky that looked like wet slate. The sea below pulsed in slow, endless rhythm, each wave breaking with the same soft sigh. I made coffee on a small portable stove, then sat at the table where I'd seen the photograph the night before. In daylight, I could see the details more clearly. Elias Rowan, tall and lean, his hair combed neatly, standing beside a woman with a round face and calm eyes. She wore a dress with a high collar, her hand resting on his arm. Both of them looked out at the camera, unsmiling, but there was something kind in their gaze, that quiet steadiness of people who have spent years watching the sea and each other. A note was tucked behind the photo. I eased it out carefully. The ink had bled, but I could still make out the words. "If ever the light goes out, remember, the sea keeps the tune." I sat back, letting that sentence sink in. It was simple, almost cryptic, but it felt true. The light, the song, the presence I thought I'd felt. All pieces of something that had survived long past its time. When the coffee was gone, I walked outside. The wind pushed at me gently, carrying the smell of salt and rain. The fog was thick enough to blur the cliffs into ghosts. At the base of the lighthouse, I found a small brass plate half buried in moss. I wiped it clean with my sleeve. In memory of Mara Rowan, 1871–1903, the humming stopped. The sea grew quiet. I stood there, breath caught, the wind brushing past my face like a sigh. And then, only for a moment, I heard a man's voice. Low, close, almost beside me. She always sang when it rained. I turned sharply, but no one was there. Only the waves below, their edges silvered with light. I whispered, Elias. But the name broke apart in the wind. The fog began to lift just enough for the beam to find me again, sweeping over my face before gliding back toward the sea. I stayed still, feeling its warmth against my skin, as if someone had reached out from another time to say, keep the light burning. That afternoon, the sky cleared just enough for the sea to show its color again, a deep, bruised blue. The wind carried the smell of rain, but the world felt oddly still. Inside the cottage, I found myself drawn back to the logbook, as though the pages were whispering for company. There were names and dates I hadn't noticed before, tiny notes written in the margins like private thoughts. Some of them weren't signed by Elias, some were written in a smaller, looping hand I guessed belonged to Mara. The ink on her entries was lighter, faded to grey, but her words were more intimate, almost like letters she never meant anyone to read. June 19th. Elias dreams with his eyes open. He says the sea speaks to him when the fog is thick. I listen too, but all I hear are waves. August 7th. We danced in the lantern room tonight. The wind howled around us, but the light didn't falter. I think that means something. I think the light knows us. I turned the pages slowly, afraid the paper would crumble. Then came one that made me pause. December 2nd. Elias went down to the shore after dark. He said the light called to him. I waited, humming so he could find his way back. The sea took his voice, but not his name. There was no entry after that. The next page was blank, save for a faint ring of water, as though a tear or a raindrop had fallen there a century ago and refused to dry. Outside, the beam continued its patient rotation, sweeping over the windows. Every time it passed, the cottage brightened and dimmed like the rhythm of breath. I caught myself whispering aloud, "You're both still here, aren't you?" It wasn't a question that needed answering. The air had that same electric stillness you feel before a storm. Charged, expectant, alive. I decided to walk down to the shoreline before dusk. The path was narrow and rocky, bordered by wild grass that whispered as I passed. I half expected to find nothing but driftwood and gulls, but at the base of the cliff there was something else, a line of small stones arranged carefully in a spiral. It wasn't natural. Someone, or something, had placed them there. At the center, a flat piece of slate bore 3 carved initials. EMRI crouched, tracing the grooves with my thumb. The marks were deep, deliberate. "Elias and Mara Rowan," I said softly. "You made this?" A wave broke over the rocks, spraying my face. It was freezing, but when I wiped it away, I realized the air was utterly still again. No gulls, no wind. Only the faint hum of the lighthouse behind me, and underneath that, so faint I almost missed it, the tune again. The same wordless melody floating over the waves. I followed it back up the path. With every step, I could feel the vibration of the ground, like the earth itself remembered their footsteps. By the time I reached the cottage, dusk had returned. The lens turned overhead, its reflection gliding across the glass panes like a heartbeat. On the table, the logbook lay open again. I hadn't left it that way. A new line of handwriting had appeared on the blank page, faint but legible. "The sea keeps the tune, Eli." I stared at it until the words blurred. My heart felt unsteady, like the lighthouse beam itself had entered my chest. Outside, the fog rolled back in, wrapping everything in white. The storm rolled in without warning. By dusk the sea had turned black, and the air was thick with salt and static. Waves slammed the rocks so hard that spray rattled the window panes. The lighthouse beams swept wildly through the fog, cutting streaks of silver across the dark. Inside the cottage, every floorboard seemed to groan under the weight of wind and memory. It felt less like weather, more like someone trying to wake the dead. I'd been reading by lantern light when the power failed. The room dimmed to a faint orange glow, and the wind rose to a scream that made the whole structure shudder. I could hear the sea below, not waves anymore, but a single rolling roar, relentless and enormous. I stepped outside into the storm, pulling my jacket tight. The lighthouse towered ahead, its beams slicing the rain, steady despite the gale. The lens turned in slow perfection, its rhythm unbroken. I shouted into the wind, "How are you still running?" But the storm took the words. Lightning flashed. For an instant I saw the sea like molten steel, the surf rising higher than the rocks. And then something else, a figure standing near the spiral of stones at the base of the cliff. A woman. Her dress clung to her legs, her hair lifted by the wind. She didn't look at me. She faced the sea, one hand raised slightly, palm open. The moment the lightning vanished, she was gone. I ran toward the edge, heart pounding, but the path was slippery and half washed out. When I reached the spot, the spiral of stones was gone, scattered by waves or something larger. The rain was blinding, and then, through the thunder, I heard it again. That humming voice. Only this time it wasn't far away. It was all around me, close to my ear, moving with the wind. The same tune I'd heard from the logbook's pages, the one the sea seemed to know. I climbed the tower steps, 2 at a time, breathless. The air inside was damp and electric. The lens revolved calmly, as if unaware of the storm battering the walls. But beneath its glow on the floor, near the mechanism, lay something new. A small wooden box, water-swollen, its brass latch corroded green. I knelt, pried it open. Inside were folded pages tied with ribbon. Letters, dozens of them, ink faded, paper thin as petals. The first one I touched was signed Mara Rowan, my dearest Elias, the sea is cruel tonight. You said you would be home before the light turned, but the water keeps calling. If you hear my voice, follow it home. I'll sing until you do. The wind moaned through the cracks in the glass, and some deep, aching understanding, settled in my chest. Elias had gone into the sea. She had sung to bring him back, and maybe, in some way beyond sense or time, she still was. I stood there as lightning illuminated the room again. In the reflection of the glass, 2 figures stood behind me. A man and a woman, hand in hand, their faces calm, their eyes full of light. When the next flash came, I was alone again. But the humming hadn't stopped. It had become my own breath. When morning came, the storm was gone as if it had never been. The air was washed clean. Every blade of grass glittered with salt and light. I hadn't slept. The box of letters sat open beside me, its paper damp but intact. Each page seemed to glow faintly in the early sun, as though the ink had stored its own kind of light. And for the first time in years I didn't feel alone. I felt expected. I carried the letters down to the table in the keeper's cottage. They smelled faintly of the sea and lavender, the same scent that lingered in the lantern room. I spread them out carefully, ordered by date. The handwriting shifted from steady to trembling, the way a voice does when it starts to break. The first few were ordinary. Notes about the tides, recipes for bread, mentions of gulls nesting on the roof. But after December of 1903, the tone changed. The words thinned into grief. Elias, the waves still call your name. I've lit the lamp every night since you went out in the storm. Sometimes I think I see you in the beam. a shadow moving just beyond the glass. If you find your way back, follow the song. Another, I can't leave this place. The sea keeps its promises too well. Each night it hums your tune, and I hum with it. I don't know where one of us ends anymore. Her last letter wasn't dated. The ink had bled from water, the words soft and bruised. If the light still burns, then so do we. I ran my thumb over those words until they blurred. It struck me that her devotion wasn't about loss. It was about connection. She wasn't clinging to memory. She was merging with it, keeping him alive through light and song. Outside, the sea was calm again, like glass. The beams still turned slowly, endlessly. I read her letters aloud one by one. My voice wavered at first, but as I went on, something curious happened. The rhythm of the waves began to fall in time with my speaking. When I stopped, the silence felt unnatural, so I started again. Softer, more like reciting a prayer. "I'll sing until you do," I whispered, repeating her words. The sound carried through the cracked window, over the grass, down to the water. Then I heard another voice, faint but certain, a man's, low and rough like stones under the tide. "You found her words." I froze. She waited, the voice continued. We both did. I looked toward the lighthouse. The door stood ajar, its hinges glinting. I took one step toward it, then another, feeling that same hum underfoot, that impossible pulse that had been there since the first night. At the threshold, I stopped. The air smelled like salt and iron, but beneath that something sweeter. The same lavender again. The same voice that hummed in the fog now seemed to come from within the walls, woven through the sound of the turning lens. I whispered, "Elias." "Is that you?" No answer. Only the sea outside whispering its own reply. "If the light still burns, then so do we." The beams swept past me again, painting the room in white, and for an instant, maybe less than that, I saw a woman standing in the lantern room above, her hand resting on the glass. She smiled. Then the light turned, and she was gone. That night I couldn't stay in the cottage. The walls felt too still, the air too heavy with unspoken words. Something in the lighthouse was calling, not loud, but steady, like the memory of a heartbeat. Every time the beam swept across the cliffs, I felt it inside my chest, like an echo searching for its source. And before I realized it, I was climbing the spiral stairs again, barefoot, carrying only the lantern and Mara's last letter. Each step creaked like a note in a song I was learning by heart. The iron railing was cold beneath my hand, slick with the damp of evening. Outside the sea was calm, but the air shimmered. That same unreal quiet that follows a storm when everything seems to be listening. When I reached the lantern room, I stopped. The lens was turning slowly, the great prisms catching the moonlight, scattering it in ribbons across the glass walls. It looked like a breathing thing, alive, patient, and impossibly old. I set the lantern down and unfolded Mara's final letter. The paper trembled slightly, but maybe that was just me. I read the words again, softly, like a confession. "If the light still burns, then so do we." The wind sighed through the cracks, and for a moment I thought I heard her answer. The faint hum, that same melody, circling the tower with the wind. I closed my eyes and began to hum along, slowly, tentatively. The tone of the lens deepened, as if it responded, not with sound, but with movement. Its rotation slowed, then steadied in rhythm with my breath. I kept humming, feeling the vibration through the metal floor, through my bones, and then warmth. A soft glow filled the room, golden rather than white. I opened my eyes. Elias stood near the mechanism. His figure was faint, made of light and air, but his face was clear, calm, gentle, eyes reflecting the sea. Beside him stood Mara, her hand resting lightly on his sleeve. They looked at me as though I were an old friend who had finally arrived. "You found us?" she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I think you found me," I managed. Elias nodded. "The sea remembers everything. The light only shows the way back." The wind pressed against the glass, making the tower moan softly. The light between them flickered but didn't fade. "I was meant to restore this place," I said. "But maybe it was already whole," Mara smiled faintly. "It only needed someone willing to listen." They turned toward each other then, and for a moment, the light between them brightened, not blinding, just warm, like the color of a candle held close to your skin. When I blinked, they were gone. The room was empty again except for the hum of the lens and the echo of that fading tune. I sat on the floor, back against the glass, breathing with the rhythm of the sea. The letter in my hand was blank now. The ink dissolved completely. Below me, the waves lapped against the rocks, steady and unhurried. I realized I was smiling. Morning came soft and silver, the sea calm as breath. The fog had lifted entirely, revealing a coastline I hadn't truly seen before. The cliffs glowed amber beneath the early light, and the waves folded themselves neatly at their feet. For the first time, the lighthouse looked alive, not ancient or ruined, but waiting. And I knew what I was supposed to do. It wasn't about fixing the place. It was about helping it remember. I spent the next few days in quiet rhythm. Each morning began with coffee and the sound of gulls. Each evening ended with the hum of the lens. The storm had cleared something inside me too. Some dense fog of thought I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. The restoration wasn't technical work anymore. It was personal. I replaced the cracked window panes in the lantern room, polished the brass fittings, cleaned every gear and cog that still turned. There was no power, but somehow the light stayed alive, steady as ever. I stopped questioning it. Some things weren't meant to be explained, only honored. I painted the cottage shutters a muted sea green, the color of calm after rain, repaired the roof, swept years of dust from the floor. I set the photograph of Elias and Mara back on the mantel, this time framed with care. When the townspeople from the village down the coast finally came to check the site, they found me on the ladder outside, painting the doorframe. A woman with sun-faded hair called up to me, shading her eyes. "You're the one restoring the Rowan light, aren't you?" she asked. I smiled down. "Trying to," she nodded thoughtfully. "And my grandfather used to tell stories about it. Said it always came on during storms, even after it was abandoned. No one could explain it." Her voice carried that mix of curiosity and respect people reserve for old mysteries. "Maybe it just remembers what it was built for," I said. She grinned. "Maybe it remembers them." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. That evening, after they'd gone, I stood by the cliff edge again. The wind was gentle now, brushing against the grass like the sweep of a hand. The beam circled slowly, casting its path over the open sea. I thought of Mara's last letter. If the light still burns, then so do we, and I thought of my wife, her laugh, the way she used to say that every building I designed looked like I was trying to build something that could survive the end of the world. Maybe she'd been right. Maybe that's all any of us ever try to do, make something that endures, something that remembers us when we're gone. I whispered to the wind, "This one's for all of you." The beam swept over me then, slow and deliberate. For a heartbeat, I felt warmth across my face, like a hand resting there. And in that light, I could almost hear the faintest harmony, a man's hum, a woman's song, rising and falling with the tide. The light turned once more, steady and endless. The night before I left, the air was perfectly still. No fog, no wind, just the slow whisper of the sea and the patient breath of the light. I sat outside on the cottage steps, the lantern beside me, my notebook open but untouched. I wasn't sketching anymore. The lighthouse had already drawn itself in my memory, and yet I stayed up long past midnight waiting for something I couldn't name. Maybe a goodbye, maybe an answer. The beam turned its rhythm across the cliffs, sweeping over the water in long, quiet arcs. Every time it passed, I could see faint glimmers in the wave, like reflections or memories still surfacing. Inside, the cottage was almost unrecognizable. Fresh paint, clean wood, the faint scent of salt and lavender. On the mantel, the photograph of Elias and Mara stood centered between two small glass jars I'd found washed up near the rocks. I didn't know if they were theirs, but they belonged there. I took the logbook from the table, the same one that had carried their handwriting through a century of storms, and turned to the last page, the one where new words had appeared days before. "The sea keeps the tune, Eli." I touched the page lightly with my pen, then added a final entry in my own hand. November 5th. The light burns steady. The sea is calm. The keepers are home. Outside the air trembled, just a little. A soft hum threaded through the night, low and familiar. I walked down to the water one last time. The tide was out, leaving a thin mirror of wet sand stretching toward the horizon. The beam from the lighthouse spilled across it, a silver road leading nowhere and everywhere at once. Standing there, I thought of everything that had led me here. The years of silence after losing her, the ache I carried like an anchor. And yet now, under this vast quiet, I didn't feel hollow anymore, just full of sound, of sea, of light. The wind lifted gently, brushing against my face. "Thank you," I whispered. A voice. Two voices. "Really?" answered, soft as breath. "Keep it burning." Then the air stilled again. The horizon dissolved into black. I turned back toward the lighthouse. It looked different now, brighter, somehow taller. The beam reached farther than before, stretching deep into the dark like a heartbeat shared across centuries. When I climbed the stairs to the lantern room for the last time, the light seemed to welcome me, not blinding, but warm. I stood beside the lens and rested my palm against its turning glass. It pulsed once beneath my hand, almost like a reply. I closed my eyes. For a moment I could hear them. The faint harmony of their song mingled with the ocean's breathing, the same eternal rhythm, and I realized it wasn't a haunting. It was a promise. The light turned again, slow and steady. I stayed until dawn, watching it sweep the horizon, the world reborn with every rotation. When I finally left Crescent Bay, the road behind me glowed faintly in the rearview mirror. The beam followed me a little while longer, like a farewell wave before fading into daylight. Somewhere out there, the sea still kept the tune, and the light never went out.